Hi, my name is Sergio Ronchetti and I am the composer and sound designer on Eldest Souls. We recently released a DLC called Depths of the Forgotten, and with that came 3 new tracks which I thought would be cool to talk about a little bit how I wrote them from start to finish. With the original soundtrack, I had the intention of creating songs which resembled more like an aggressive orchestral sound, something more akin to like heavy metal songs rather than traditional orchestration. Also because I never had classical training in any respect, I spent years touring in a metal band instead. So trying to lean into that musical heritage that I have that's kind of unique to me. With the DLC, I wanted to lean into this even further. So I set myself an objective of creating a sound that if I was listening to a playlist of mine and I went from Lamb of God to Machine Head to Slipknot and then one of my tracks came up, there would be no dip in energy in terms of sound. Whether I got there or not is like kind of irrelevant. It's more of an objective to get as close as I can to something and hopefully create something new. So with that in mind, I stick to what sounds good as opposed to what is realistic or playable by actual human beings and not MIDI program. I started with diving into the samples that I already had and tweaking them in a way that would suit this idea, this objective that I had, this vision. So I went with the cellos first and I panned them hard left and hard right, very similar to the way a metal soundtrack is mixed, right, and recorded, the way the guitars are recorded, treating them as such. And I went in there, I tightened the attacks and the releases, I made them sound more aggressive, more staccato, give them a little bit more bite. I added some saturation, a little bit of distortion, some clip gain, and I layered them even. I experimented with adding a pitched down version of each one. In the same way that when we track metal guitars for band recordings, there are several layers on each side, each guitar, to create that wall of sound kind of idea. I even tried to do different things with maybe the brass, pushing them way back in the distance with like a wash of reverb and adding some distortion to create a slightly different texture to what we're used to. And the idea is that I'd use these 2 elements to recreate the sound of a band with guitars, bass, and drums. Obviously also very heavily drum reliant to push that driving force and kind of replace that double kick pedal sound that we hear in so many metal songs. After that, it was just a question of finding the material to write with this new sound. And again, trying to lean in even further into my metal influences, I decided to dive into all the songs that I really like and lift riffs and ideas from there as a starting point. So what I did was find a song with a riff or a really short segment that I thought would work, maybe 5 seconds or just a guitar riff, and I would try and translate that with the orchestral textures that I had created. And this took many attempts. There were several songs that did not make the cut, and I just kept kind of fighting through all of these ideas until something sounded good, basically. And something translated well, essentially. I didn't want to work out why things translated well and why things didn't. More just trial and error and experimenting until something stuck, basically. It was a question of, can I replace this guitar riff with the staccato cello sound that I just created? Are my drums enough to replace the drum beat that they've got in their songs, etc., etc.? Eventually what I had was this myriad of tiny little segments, tiny little puzzle pieces that I could then start to piece together in some sort of structure. Now, being a Souls-like inspired game, we took a lot of inspiration from things like Dark Souls 3, from Bloodborne, and in that the music as well. What I didn't do in the first game was pay enough close attention to the structure of the songs that they had in these existing games. Instead, what I did was overdo it with these complicated adaptive systems where things would change for tiny little moments within each fight and encounter with a god. And what it turned out to be was just overly complicated. In hindsight, I realized that the players spend on average 2, maybe 3 minutes at a time in a boss fight before they either die or they defeat the boss. Meaning that my 5 to 7 minutes of clever adaptiveness was never heard because they'd stopped playing before that. So diving into back into my research with games like Bloodborne, I noticed that they had a very simple structure for most of their fights, being a really cool sounding track and then a simple loop point somewhere in there. So instead of aiming for 5 to 7 minutes of gameplay, I'd make sure that it could loop maybe once or twice before getting repetitive or noticeably boring, for example. Again, I lifted the structures from some of the Bloodborne tracks and I copied them for my own ones. And in that, what you're doing is taking a proven method of creating tracks for games and simply reapplying it in the style that I'm working with. And as a result, I think they came out a lot smoother. The whole process was a lot smoother, and I think the gameplay is better for it as well. The next process was the mixing stage, and at the start of this, I always knew I was going to pass it off to somebody else. My expertise do not lie in mixing, and being realistic in that, I always had the idea of passing it on to somebody else. So my friend Joel Grant is going to go into more detail about how he took my initial ideas, my initial vision, and enhanced it with all of his expertise and fantastic processing.
Thanks, Sergio. We're going to do a quick little speed run here through the production of this song, starting with the drums up here at the top. Now, the original audio Sergio sent me for the drums was just this one audio track, some action hits. They're pretty good, nice and punchy and heavy, but we want to add more layers to make this song bigger. Start with some low end, big cinema hit for the downbeats at the top. Then I added in some cinema drums from Spitfire for some high-end toms, some taikos from East West for some low end, and then some Persian battle drums from East West for some good mid-range. That's where we get a lot of our good articulation too for these rolls. However you find a good blend of drums is up to you. I like this little mix I made for his production, but it is good to find different samples that work well together to represent different kinds of articulation and different ends of the frequency spectrum. Add some metals and some cymbals. And then more importantly, our mix processing here, we just roll off a little low end on this EQ, just everything below 50 I cut off just to lose the boom. Nice signal chain here from Isotope for some compression and saturation. Decapitator for more saturation. Just mixed to 10, but it always helps. And then a little bus compressor just to pull those peaks down a little bit. But nice big drums, right? All right, which brings us next to our strings, the really important part of this production. Now, Sergio's request was to get the mix to sound a little more like a metal song, so I kind of treated the cellos like they were our electric rhythm guitars by panning them to hard left and hard right. Let's get those drums out here so we can just hear these guys. Left and right. I also have these sends, sending the cello signal to these extra buses over here, where I do a tremendous amount of distortion and compression and pan them hard left and hard right, almost like I would distort an electric guitar. They're mixed down so you can't hear them that much, but to illustrate how crunchy they are. And the right one. Now inside the mix, they help give the cellos a big edge and kind of stick out and give a lot of grit to the whole production. And as we roll down, really I like to fill the extra spaces. We have these, again, these are the higher violins, kind of being treated the same way. They're being sent to these other buses. They're a little quiet in the mix, but we got these versions of, these distorted versions of them as well, just like we treated the cellos. The overall production for strings getting pretty big. Nice and big. Some little pads here and there just to fill up our space. Kind of using these vocals as pads too. Which brings us kind of here to the end, We just have a nice simple signal chain. I don't like to do a lot of mixing, or especially not a lot of compressing or heavy compressing in the mix bus for a song that's going to be implemented into Wise. That way, as we solo these stems out to bounce the stems and put the stems into Wise, we're not getting a different version of the stems because they're hitting the compressor a little differently. So I tend to have the compressors that are on here are very low on the threshold, so they're barely doing anything at all. So most of what you find on my mix bus is just some simple EQ that will be applied to everything. Kind of just to brighten things up. Same with this isotope trash, another saturator I like to add on top of stuff. Many different small layers of brightening up our mix. Again, some high-end saturation there at the end too. I find that when you rely a lot on these samples, they are mixed pretty dark and low-endy, if that's not a real word, but it does help to kind of try and find ways to brighten them in the mix to get these big, loud, bright mixes.
There were a few things that I did differently on this process to make my workflow a lot simpler. One being having all of my tracks in the same DAW project session, right? The same Logic session for every track, meaning that I would have the same instruments used in each one, with the slight exception of adding maybe a new articulation or effect in a couple places where the songs needed it. Compared to the way I did the original soundtrack for Eldest Souls, the main game, I didn't follow this kind of neat structure. Each song had a different set of instruments, different instrumentation, and it just made the mixing and exporting process a nightmare. Particularly keeping the consistency between tracks which had very different sounds, different drums, different string articulations, different instruments that weren't included in the previous, etc., etc. Again, considering being efficient because I'm working to a deadline as a working composer, it's important to consider that our job and our art is finished when the deadline says so. So we have to make sure that we get there and we are happy with the quality of it. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a happy place. So that was one of the things I did. It definitely sped up the mixing process because then Joel, essentially we figured out the sound that we wanted for the first track, and then after that we could simply use that as a template for the next two because we knew the sound was going to be more or less in the same ballpark. So did I meet the original vision of getting that same energy as a heavy metal band? I'm not sure, but even if I've come close to it, which I think I have, I'm happy with that. I think overreaching with your goals is a great exercise, accepting the fact that you may not get there, and that's fine. It's not really about setting yourself a goal and nailing it, you know, in terms of defining your success. It's more about the journey that you take towards it and kind of adapting as the path unfolds for you.